The sentence that ended my marriage didn't sound dramatic when she said it. Melissa lifted her champagne glass under the warm gold lights of the ballroom and laughed like she'd just delivered the perfect joke. Living with Daniel is holding me back from achieving my dreams. The people around the table laughed with her. Not politely, not awkwardly. They laughed the way people do when they believe the punchline is safe. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't interrupt. I just sat there in a rented tuxedo that suddenly felt tighter around the collar and listened to the sound echo across the room. If you've ever been in a moment like that, you know the strange thing about humiliation. It doesn't explode. It settles, quiet and cold, like snow falling on a frozen lake. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 41 years old, born and raised outside Chicago, and until that night, I thought I understood my marriage. Melissa and I had been together 12 years. From the outside, we looked like one of those couples people point to as proof that hard work pays off. She had the sharp suits, the executive job, the kind of confidence that made boardrooms listen. I had something quieter, the kind of life that doesn't show up on LinkedIn headlines. But the people at that table didn't know any of that. To them, I was just the quiet husband who showed up at company events and stood politely near the bar. One of Melissa's coworkers leaned across the table with a grin that had clearly been lubricated by a few glasses of Cabernet. "So what do you actually do all day, Daniel?" he asked. Melissa didn't even let me answer. She smiled the same polished corporate smile she used during presentations. "Oh, Daniel keeps things simple," she said lightly. "He mostly stays home." More laughter. A couple of heads nodded like the situation made perfect sense. In their world, ambition was measured in promotions, stock options, and corner offices with a skyline view. Silence didn't register as strength. It registered as absence. I swirled the whiskey in my glass and watched the ice rotate slowly like a quiet clock, counting down something no one else in the room could see. Melissa was glowing tonight. Emerald dress, perfect hair, the confidence of someone climbing fast in a powerful company. I remembered when that confidence had first appeared. Back when we were younger, when ambition still sounded like a shared dream instead of a competition. But somewhere along the way, success had changed the temperature of our house. Not loudly. Just a few degrees colder each year. The strange thing is, I wasn't angry sitting there in that ballroom. Not yet. Anger is loud. What I felt was something else entirely. Clarity. Because while the laughter circled the table and the skyline lights of downtown Chicago flickered through the tall windows behind us, I realized something Melissa didn't understand yet. She thought I was the man holding her back. She had no idea she was sitting across the table from the man who was about to change the entire direction of her world. The laughter faded eventually, the way noise always does when the band starts playing again and the waiters move through the room with silver trays and polite smiles. Conversations drifted back to quarterly earnings and upcoming promotions as if nothing important had just been said. But moments like that do not disappear. They settle into memory with perfect clarity. I remember the way the chandelier light reflected off the glasses on the table. I remember the low hum of the city outside the ballroom windows, traffic moving along Lakeshore Drive like a quiet river of headlights. And I remember the way Melissa did not look at me again for the rest of the evening. That part mattered more than the joke. People laugh at many things in a room full of executives. Alcohol and ambition make that easy. But indifference is colder. Indifference tells you the distance between two people has already grown larger than the room they are standing in. I finished my drink slowly and placed the glass back on the table with a soft click. No one noticed. That was the strange thing about the role I had been playing for years. When people believe you are unimportant, you become almost invisible. Invisible men hear everything. Across the table, one of Melissa's colleagues leaned toward her and lowered his voice just enough to sound conspiratorial. "You are up for the regional director position next quarter, right?" he asked. Melissa nodded with the calm confidence of someone who had rehearsed that moment in her head 100 times. "That is the plan," she said. "If everything goes the way leadership expects." Another man raised his glass toward her. "You deserve it. Fastest rise we have seen in this division." She smiled again, that same bright smile that had once belonged only to me during quiet evenings in our old apartment when the future still felt like something we were building together. "Thank you," she said. "I have worked very hard to get here." I did not disagree with that. Melissa had always been driven. Even when we were younger, when money was tight and we measured our grocery bill down to the last dollar. She carried that fire in her voice when she talked about the future. Back then I admired it. I supported it. In many ways, I helped build the runway she used to take off. But success has a quiet side effect that few people talk about. The higher someone climbs, the easier it becomes for them to forget who held the ladder steady at the beginning. The band began playing a slow jazz rhythm near the front of the ballroom, the kind of music designed to make executives feel sophisticated while they discuss strategy over expensive wine. I leaned back slightly in my chair and watched Melissa from across the table as she spoke with her colleagues about expansion plans, market forecasts, and leadership potential. They saw a rising star. What they did not see was the timeline quietly unfolding behind the scenes. Because while Melissa had been climbing the corporate ladder inside this company, another set of decisions had been happening far above her pay grade. Meetings in quiet offices, long conversations about ownership percentages and controlling shares. The kind of conversations that do not happen at dinner tables or networking events. They happen in boardrooms where the real future of a company is decided. And in less than 12 hours, one of those decisions was going to walk through the front door of Melissa's office building. The funny thing about ambition is that it makes people look forward. They spend so much time focusing on the next promotion, the next title, the next milestone, that they rarely stop to look behind them. Melissa did not look behind her that night either. If she had, she might have noticed that the quiet man everyone dismissed had already finished playing the role she thought defined him. After the dinner finally ended, the ballroom emptied the way a theater does after the final curtain call. People gathered their coats, exchanged business cards, and promised to reconnect over coffee that would probably never happen. Melissa stayed near the center of the room, surrounded by a small circle of coworkers who still seemed energized by the evening. I watched from a distance as they spoke about market expansion, promotion rumors, and which executive might take the next seat on the leadership team. It was the language of ambition, the kind that fills glass buildings across downtown Chicago every morning at 8 o'clock sharp. I stepped outside into the cool night air before Melissa noticed I had gone. October had already begun to pull the warmth out of the city. The wind moving off Lake Michigan carried that familiar edge that tells you winter is only a few weeks away. Streetlights reflected across the pavement, and traffic rolled past in steady waves of yellow taxis and rideshare cars. For a moment, I just stood there on the sidewalk, breathing in the quiet. Not the kind of silence that feels empty, the kind that feels like space. Sometimes the loudest moments in life are followed by the calmest realizations. The valet brought the car around, and I thanked him before sliding into the driver's seat. The dashboard clock glowed softly in the dark. 10:43 in the evening. Melissa would probably stay another half hour networking before she came out looking for me. That had become our routine at these events. I drove the short distance home through streets lined with late-night restaurants and glowing office towers, where people were still finishing presentations for the morning. Chicago never really sleeps. It just slows down enough for people to hear their own thoughts. By the time I reached the house, the neighborhood was quiet. A few porch lights burned in the distance, and somewhere down the block a dog barked once before settling again. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the familiar stillness of the living room. 12 years of marriage had filled that house with thousands of ordinary memories. Weekend breakfasts, quiet Sunday afternoons, long conversations about what the future might look like. Back when that future still felt shared. I set my keys on the kitchen counter and poured a glass of water. The refrigerator hummed softly behind me, the same steady sound it had made every night for years. Ordinary sounds have a strange comfort to them. They remind you that the world keeps moving even when something inside your life has shifted. I leaned against the counter and thought about the moment at the table again, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet understanding. Melissa believed the story she had told her colleagues tonight. In her mind, she had outgrown the man she married. She believed ambition had lifted her into a different orbit. But ambition has a blind spot. It focuses so intensely on where you want to go that it rarely considers who might already be standing there when you arrive. I finished the water and glanced at the folder resting on the dining table near the window. Inside were documents that had taken months of careful negotiation to assemble. Ownership agreements, transfer approvals, signatures from people whose decisions shaped the future of companies far larger than the one Melissa worked for. Tomorrow morning those signatures would become official. Tomorrow morning, a new majority shareholder would step into the building where Melissa spent the last decade building her career. And when that door opened, the quiet husband everyone laughed about would no longer be invisible. Melissa came home a little after 11:30 that night. I heard the soft sound of her heels in the hallway before the front door opened, followed by the familiar rustle of her coat as she stepped inside. She looked energized in the way people often do after a successful evening of networking, her voice carrying a light confidence as she placed her purse on the entry table. She did not notice me at first. I was still sitting at the dining table where the folder rested beneath the warm glow of the overhead light. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of traffic passing somewhere beyond the neighborhood streets. Melissa walked into the kitchen and finally saw me there. For a moment she paused, slightly surprised. "You left early," she said, removing the earrings she had worn to the dinner and setting them carefully beside the sink. Her tone was casual, the way people speak when they assume the evening has already been filed away as unimportant. I nodded once. "I figured you had plenty of conversations to finish," I said. She gave a small laugh, pouring herself a glass of water before leaning against the counter. "You know how those events are," she replied. "Everyone wants 5 minutes with whoever might be making the next decision." She took a sip and looked at me with a polite curiosity. "Did you have a good time at least?" It was an interesting question, not because of the words themselves, but because of the quiet assumption behind them. Melissa believed the evening had unfolded exactly the way she expected. A room full of ambitious people. A few jokes. A few compliments. Another step forward in the career she had worked so hard to build. She had no reason to think anything else had happened. I looked at the glass in my hand and turned it slowly between my fingers. "It was interesting," I said. That seemed to satisfy her. Melissa always preferred simple answers to complicated questions, especially when she was tired. She walked past the table toward the hallway, already halfway out of the conversation. "Tomorrow is going to be a big day at the office," she said casually. "There is a board meeting in the morning. Leadership has been hinting about some kind of announcement." I watched her for a moment, noticing the quiet excitement in her voice. She had been chasing the next step in her career for years now, and every rumor about new leadership decisions felt like another door about to open. "What kind of announcement?" I asked. She shrugged slightly. "No one knows for sure yet," she replied. "But when the board calls a meeting with less than 24 hours notice, it usually means something big." She started toward the staircase before pausing and glancing back at me. "You should see the building tomorrow," she added with a small smile. "Everyone will be trying to guess who is about to move up." Then she disappeared upstairs, leaving the kitchen quiet again. I remained at the table for a while after that, listening to the distant sound of the shower turning on in the bathroom above me. Her words echoed softly in my mind. Something big. In the morning, the elevators inside that glass tower downtown would open like they always did, carrying hundreds of employees toward another day of meetings and emails and quiet competition. Melissa believed tomorrow might bring a promotion. She believed the board meeting was about someone climbing higher. The truth was simpler than that. Tomorrow was not about someone moving up. Tomorrow was about someone new arriving at the top. Morning arrived quietly, the pale gray light of Chicago slipping through the kitchen windows just after 6:30. The house was still silent except for the distant hum of the heating system pushing warm air through the vents. I had been awake for almost an hour already. Some mornings carry a certain weight to them, the kind that makes sleep feel unnecessary. I poured coffee into a simple ceramic mug and stood by the window looking out over the quiet street. A delivery truck rolled slowly past the corner, and somewhere down the block a garage door opened with a mechanical groan as another neighbor started their routine commute. Melissa came downstairs a little after 7, already dressed for the day. Her navy blue suit was sharp and precise, the kind of professional armor she wore whenever something important was expected at the office. She moved quickly through the kitchen, gathering her bag and checking the screen of her phone with the focused expression of someone mentally preparing for a meeting. "The board meeting is at 9, she said while reaching for the coffee pot. "Everyone is already talking about it in the company chat." Her voice carried that same quiet excitement from the night before. She believed the day might hold something significant for her career. I nodded and took another sip of coffee. "Sounds like an important morning," I said. She smiled faintly at that, as if the understatement amused her. "Important mornings are the reason people stay late at events like last night," she replied. That is where you hear the rumors before anyone else. Melissa walked toward the door, then paused to slip on her coat. I might be late tonight, she added. If the announcement leads to follow-up meetings, things could run long. I watched her for a moment, noticing how confident she looked stepping into the day. For Melissa, the building downtown represented everything she had been working toward for years. Promotions, recognition, the steady climb toward a corner office that overlooked the lake. She believed today might bring her closer to that future. Good luck with the meeting, I said. She gave a quick nod, already halfway out the door before the words finished leaving my mouth. A moment later the engine of her car started in the driveway, and the quiet neighborhood absorbed the sound as she drove away toward the skyline rising in the distance. I finished my coffee slowly and rinsed the mug in the sink. Then I walked into the dining room where the folder still rested on the table exactly where I had left it the night before. The documents inside represented months of careful negotiation, quiet conversations with people whose influence rarely appeared in headlines. Agreements about ownership, decisions about direction, the kind of changes that reshape companies without most employees realizing what has happened until the effects begin to ripple through the building. I opened the folder and glanced through the pages one last time. Everything was already finalized. The signatures were there. The approvals had been filed. Today was not about deciding anything. Today was simply about arrival. By 8:15, I was driving downtown myself, the morning traffic moving steadily along the expressway toward the glass towers clustered near the lake. The sun had risen higher now, reflecting off the windows of the city in bright sheets of light. Commuters hurried along the sidewalks carrying briefcases and coffee cups, each person focused on their own schedule for the day. When I turned onto the street where Melissa's company building stood, the entrance was already busy with employees arriving for work. They walked through the revolving doors without looking twice at the man stepping out of the car across the street. To them, I was just another visitor heading toward a meeting. They had no way of knowing that by the time the boardroom doors closed at 9 o'clock, the quiet husband they laughed about the night before would be sitting at the head of the table. The lobby of the building carried the quiet energy of a normal weekday morning, the kind of atmosphere where people moved quickly but politely, each person balancing a coffee cup and a phone while thinking about the first meeting on their calendar. The marble floor reflected the tall glass walls that framed the Chicago skyline outside, and the revolving doors turned steadily as employees filtered in from the street. I stepped through those doors at 8:43 in the morning. No one stopped me. In a place like this, confidence is its own kind of identification badge. If you walk with purpose, people assume you belong. The reception desk stood near the center of the lobby, a curved structure of polished stone with two assistants greeting employees as they passed. One of them looked up when I approached. "Good morning," she said politely. "Do you have an appointment?" I nodded and slid a small envelope across the desk. Inside was a printed confirmation from the legal office that handled the ownership transition finalized the night before. She opened it carefully, scanning the letter for a moment before her expression shifted into something more attentive. "One moment, please," she said, lifting the phone beside her keyboard. Her voice dropped into the calm professional tone used when something important appears unexpectedly. "Yes, he is here now," she said quietly. A pause followed while someone on the other end responded. Then she replaced the receiver and stood from her chair. "The boardroom is on the 32nd floor," she explained. "They are expecting you." I thanked her and walked toward the elevators at the far side of the lobby. The polished metal doors reflected the movement of the room behind me as I pressed the button for the executive floors. A few seconds later the elevator arrived with a soft chime, and the doors slid open to reveal a nearly empty car. Inside, the quiet hum of the machinery filled the space as the elevator began its climb through the building. Floors passed one by one, each number lighting briefly on the panel before disappearing again. 22, 23, 24. In another part of the building, Melissa was probably settling into her desk by now. She would be reviewing emails, preparing notes, maybe discussing the rumors about the board meeting with a few coworkers who were just as curious as she was. In her mind, the day was unfolding like any other important morning at the office. The difference was that the story she expected and the story that was actually happening were about to meet for the first time. The elevator slowed as it reached the 32nd floor, and the doors opened onto a quiet hallway lined with glass offices and framed company awards. At the far end stood a pair of dark wooden doors marked with a small bronze plaque that read boardroom. A man in a gray suit stood nearby reviewing a tablet. He looked up as I approached and offered a respectful nod, the kind that comes from someone who has already been informed about the change taking place today. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," he said. "Everyone is inside." The doors behind him were still closed, but I could hear the low murmur of voices through the polished wood. Executives discussing reports. Board members preparing for another meeting that would shape the direction of the company. They did not know that the direction was about to change in a way none of them had predicted. I reached for the handle and paused for a moment, not out of hesitation but out of clarity. Sometimes the most important turning points in life happen without any dramatic music or sudden announcements. Just a quiet door, a room full of people, and the moment someone new decides to walk in. The boardroom doors opened with a soft, controlled swing that barely disturbed the quiet conversation inside. A long table stretched across the center of the room beneath tall windows that looked out over Lake Michigan, the morning light spilling across polished wood and neatly arranged folders. Around the table sat the people who had guided the company for years. Executives in tailored suits, board members with decades of experience, the quiet architects of decisions that shaped careers across the entire organization. Their conversation slowed when I stepped inside, not because they recognized me immediately, but because unexpected arrivals tend to change the rhythm of a room. The man who had been reviewing the tablet outside followed behind me and closed the door with a gentle click. For a moment, there was silence, the kind that appears when a meeting pauses before it properly begins. One of the senior board members stood from his chair near the far end of the table. His expression was calm, but attentive. "Good morning," he said politely. "You must be Daniel Carter." I nodded once. "That is correct." He gestured toward the seat at the head of the table, the one that remained empty while the others had already taken their places. "We were expecting you," he said. The statement carried a quiet authority that immediately shifted the energy in the room. Several executives exchanged quick glances, their curiosity sharpening as they tried to understand why someone unfamiliar had just been invited to sit at the most important seat in the building. I walked toward the chair and placed the folder from the night before on the polished surface of the table. The room remained quiet, but the atmosphere had changed. The kind of silence that once ignored me now leaned closer, waiting for an explanation. The board member who had greeted me cleared his throat gently and addressed the room. "Before we begin the agenda," he said, "there is an announcement regarding ownership structure." That sentence alone was enough to shift several expressions around the table. Ownership is not a word that appears casually in corporate meetings. It carries weight, the kind that moves companies. He continued in the same calm voice. "As of yesterday evening, a controlling share of this company has officially transferred to new leadership." A low murmur passed through the room. People looked at one another, trying to calculate what that meant for the future of their positions, their departments, their plans. Then the board member gestured toward me. "Please allow me to introduce Mr. Daniel Carter, who now represents the majority ownership group." The silence that followed was heavier than before. It was not confusion anymore. It was realization beginning to form. I opened the folder and slid a copy of the signed documents across the table so that the executives nearest to me could review them. "I appreciate everyone making time for this meeting on short notice," I said calmly. My voice sounded steady, almost quiet, but every person in the room was listening now. The man who had been speaking about market forecasts moments earlier leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression, the kind people wear when the ground beneath their expectations shifts without warning. The board member beside him nodded once. "Mr. Carter will be working closely with leadership as we move forward," he added. The truth was simpler than that. I was not arriving to observe the direction of the company. I was arriving to set it. And somewhere 20 floors below, Melissa was sitting at her desk preparing for what she believed was just another important meeting. For several seconds no one spoke. The executives around the table looked down at the documents, then back at me, then at one another again, as if the meaning might change the second time they read it. It did not. Ownership percentages are simple things on paper, but they carry enormous consequences inside. A company. The man seated to my right adjusted his glasses and studied the signature page again before leaning back slowly in his chair. "This transaction happened yesterday evening?" he asked carefully. His tone was professional, but the question carried a quiet disbelief that often follows sudden change. Yes, I replied calmly. All approvals were finalized after market close. A few more murmurs passed through the room as several executives began whispering to one another. It was the kind of whisper that spreads quickly in corporate spaces, not loud enough to interrupt the meeting, but loud enough to signal that something significant has shifted. The board member who had introduced me raised his hand gently to settle the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this transition has been under discussion for several months. The legal and financial review has been thorough, and the decision was approved unanimously by the board late last night." His words landed with quiet authority, the kind that closes questions before they become objections. Across the table, one of the senior vice presidents straightened his tie and spoke with careful professionalism. "Mr. Carter," he said, "do you intend to make any immediate operational changes?" It was a reasonable question. Companies often brace themselves when new leadership arrives. Employees wonder about restructuring, departments worry about budgets, executives quietly calculate where they stand in the new order. I folded my hands lightly on the table before answering. "Not immediately," I said. "The company has strong leadership and a capable team. My first priority is understanding the structure already in place." The tension in the room eased slightly at that. People in corporate environments appreciate stability, even if they know change may come later. The board member beside me nodded approvingly. "That is a sensible approach," he said. "We will schedule a leadership briefing this afternoon so Mr. Carter can meet department heads." Another executive glanced toward the windows, thinking through the logistics of such a meeting. "Human resources will want to coordinate the announcement," she added. "Employees will hear about this quickly once the board session ends." She was correct. Information travels fast inside office buildings. By noon, the entire company would know that new ownership had arrived. I glanced once more at the skyline outside the tall windows before returning my attention to the room. The meeting moved forward with calm efficiency after that. Reports were summarized, schedules adjusted, next steps outlined with the same polished professionalism that had defined the company for years. But beneath the surface of that routine discussion, every person in the room understood something important had changed. Eventually, the board member closed his folder and looked around the table. "That concludes the ownership announcement," he said. "We will adjourn for now and reconvene with department leadership later this morning." Chairs shifted softly as executives began gathering their notes. Conversations restarted in low voices as people stood and prepared to leave the room. Outside the doors, the company continued its ordinary morning without realizing the ripple that had just begun at the top floor. Somewhere down in the open office area, Melissa was probably checking her calendar and preparing for the leadership meeting she believed might influence her future. What she did not know yet was that the future she imagined had already changed the moment I walked through those doors. The boardroom gradually emptied after the meeting adjourned, the quiet shuffle of chairs and folders replacing the earlier tension that had filled the room. Executives stepped into the hallway speaking in low voices, each conversation carrying a different tone of curiosity, calculation, or cautious optimism. Change at the top of a company always moves through a building like weather. It begins quietly, but everyone eventually feels it. I remained seated for a moment after the others left, looking out through the tall windows that overlooked the lake. The water stretched across the horizon in calm blue sheets, sunlight reflecting off its surface in bright flashes. Chicago looked the same as it had every other morning. Traffic flowed through the streets below, people hurried between buildings with coffee cups in their hands, and the city continued its rhythm without noticing that one company inside it had just turned a new page. A few minutes later, the board member who had introduced me earlier stepped back into the room. "Human Resources has scheduled the leadership briefing for 11:30, he said. "Department heads are already being notified." I nodded once and closed the folder in front of me. "Thank you," I replied. He paused for a moment before speaking again, his voice carrying the calm tone of someone who had spent years observing corporate transitions. "There is one more thing you should probably know," he said. "Your name is already moving through the building." I smiled slightly at that. Information always travels quickly in places like this. By now, managers would be whispering about the ownership announcement, assistants would be refreshing company emails, and employees would be trying to connect the unfamiliar name to the person who had just taken control of their company. The elevator ride down from the 32nd floor felt different from the ride up. Earlier, the building had treated me like a visitor. Now the quiet attention from people in the hallway suggested that word was already spreading. When the doors opened into the main office level, the atmosphere carried a subtle tension beneath the ordinary sounds of keyboards and ringing phones. Conversations paused for half a second as I stepped out of the elevator. Nothing dramatic. Just enough curiosity to confirm that the story moving through the building had a face. I walked past rows of glass offices and open workspaces until I reached the corridor leading toward the marketing department. Through the transparent walls, I could see teams gathered around desks reviewing reports, unaware that the structure above them had shifted only an hour earlier. Then I saw Melissa. She was standing near a conference table speaking with two coworkers, her posture confident and relaxed in the same navy blue suit she had worn that morning. For a moment, she did not notice me approaching. She was explaining something about the leadership meeting scheduled for later, her voice steady with the excitement of someone who believed the day might bring an opportunity. One of her colleagues looked past her shoulder first. His expression changed instantly as recognition crossed his face. Melissa noticed the shift and turned slightly to see what had caught his attention. Her eyes met mine across the glass hallway. For a second, she simply stared, confused about why I was standing in the middle of her office floor during work hours. Then she glanced at the employees nearby who were suddenly standing a little straighter, their attention moving between her and the man they had just heard about in the morning announcement. The realization reached her slowly, like sunlight breaking through clouds. I stopped a few feet away and gave a calm nod. "Good morning, Melissa," I said quietly. "It looks like we both have meetings today."